So this is where I am right now as far as the progress of my Kyosho Lazer ZX project is going. I wouldn't really call it a rebuild because it came in very good condition, and I wouldn't call it a restoration because it came in very good condition. It's really just a whole bunch of upgrades. But in any case, as you can see here, I have the upper and lower decks installed, and the front gearbox is all done with the shock towers and everything. So why don't we start here. The Pargu parts for the front and rear hinge pin mounts for the suspension arms came in. So they fit just fine. They're quite nice. So no real problems there. The belts, I actually had to order a new set. So the original belts that I got for this were the right number of teeth and everything. But the problem was that, here, let me see if I can get them out. This is the original set of belts. And maybe a little hard to see, but the ribbing, the back side of the belt here, is a little too thick between the valley, between the teeth, and the actual back surface of the belt. There's just too much material there, just barely by maybe, I don't know, half a millimeter or so, that it'll rub against the gearbox and cause friction. So I ended up having to order a set of front and rear belts from Tough Racing. They do happen to make a set for the Lazer ZX. I thought that they didn't, which is why I sourced the belts from another place. But they do actually make them. They do ship from Korea though, so it takes a little bit of time to get here. That's why I had to wait a while to get to this point. Ball diff is built and installed. It was a pretty simple build. It's nice and smooth. I got the 3mm diff balls in from Be Fast Racing. They're tungsten carbide diff balls. You can get a package of, I think, 12 of them for the Tamiya 511. And these diffs only take 10 of them, so you get 2 spares. So you just buy 2 packs and you're set. The front assembly here, these aluminum C-hubs, I originally had a bit of trouble with them because the original C-hubs here, okay, you mount the hinge pin through the king pins through these 2 holes here, and they screw into the steering block. Now on these alloy C-hubs, the hole for the kingpin is much larger, and that's because it's sized to accommodate 4x8mm bearing at the top and the bottom. Also, the actual spacing here from this bottom surface to this top surface here, this spacing is larger in the alloy set than it is in the original stock unit. So I had to play around a little bit with putting some spacers in there to eliminate slop. That's not really focusing too well. But I had like some little plastic spacers that I had lying around, and you just have to fiddle with it to get it right, basically. I think the final setting here, because there's some Z-axis play until you get all the spacers in, just to get everything to work, the final setting for this steering knuckle might be a little bit different in terms of its vertical position compared to the stock units. So you may end up having some difference in like your Ackerman, for example, or your bump steer, if this is higher or lower than the stock location. So although this is a nice looking unit, it's probably a little more trouble than it's worth if you, as far as installing it goes. I spent quite a lot of time just shimming everything and trying to get it to work right. So I wouldn't really call it a must-have upgrade. These stock units seem to be plenty beefy and plenty durable, so you shouldn't really have a problem here. Also on the stock unit, there's this little nub at the top here, and that's for the camber link. Okay, now on these alloy units, they don't have that nub. And one of the other problems was to get the top kingpin to tighten down on the steering knuckle, but not have any play here, I had to put a spacer on the top. That pushes the kingpin up, which means that, oops, the top part of this that folds down ended up rubbing against the top part of that kingpin. So then I had to put extra spacers here to push this part of the camber link up. Now that does allow it to clear the kingpin, but it does also change the suspension geometry a little bit. If you move this outer link up and or the inner link down, then you're reducing the roll center. Now for the kind of tracks that I race on, which are not particularly high traction, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you run on a high grip surface like AstroTurf or carpet, this could be a problem. You could always compensate by, you know, taking this inner mounting position and moving it up. But again, you cannot retain the factory stock suspension geometry by going to these alloy C-hubs. Okay, so that was a problem. Another thing I ran into was, I don't quite remember if the stock front units were like this. I'm pretty sure they actually are. But yeah, actually they are. In the manual, there's a little plastic spacer you have to put in here between the front hinge pin mount and the front of the suspension arm. There's a gap there. And this, when I got this chassis, I guess the original user had either taken those out or lost them or something. So I ended up taking a rubber O-ring and just putting it in there because I didn't have any shims of the perfect size, but O-rings can compress a little bit, so it fills up the spacing reasonably well and, you know, doesn't bind anything up too bad. So I'm reasonably satisfied with how the front went together. It's a little more complex than it needs to be, especially this link unit here, this plastic piece that goes up and over and down. That's really to accommodate this C-hub carrier. The Yokomo YZ10 is a heck of a lot simpler. Like for the 870C, you don't have this, because if you break this part, it's very hard to find. You can probably compensate by running a longer front turnbuckle and then putting a ball stud in here that's long so you can push it up so that the ball cup clears this kingpin here. So you could probably do that. Be a bit of a pain, but it is possible. But the whole, you know, assembly here is I think it's more complex than it needs to be. Of course, I'm biased towards the YZ10. I think it's way better, but this is all right. You know, it'll do. Put ball bearings in the steering rack. They originally came with metal bushings, so the steering rack is nice and smooth now. To its credit, it has very little slop, so that's one nice thing about it. I put CA around all the edges of the carbon fiber bits. I always struggle with whether or not I want to do that, because whenever you do put CA on the sides to help seal the edges of the carbon fiber, the CA gives off a vapor and it leaves white residue along the side of the chassis. So you could wipe that down, but then once you wipe it down, the original gloss of the carbon fiber as it came is diminished. And so the chassis doesn't look quite as good as it used to. From a distance, it looks fine, but when you really get up close to it, you can kind of see, you know, some of the imperfections. So this is where it is right now. I am working on the rear part of the drivetrain presently. I'm waiting on some parts to come in because I recently discovered that, actually I have to take this guy off, but whatever. There's a roller pin that goes on the bottom here. Oops, that's one of the little things for the diff. There's another roller pin that goes on the top of the gearbox here to keep the belt tension correct. And when I opened this up, those two roller pins were not in there. So I just ever so luckily found a new and packaged set of roller pins on eBay. It was the only one on there. And luckily it's not that expensive. It was only $10 plus shipping. So pick that up. That'll be in, oh, maybe a week or so. And then I can continue with this setup. I have started with putting the slipper clutch assembly on here. So far, it went together okay. It was a real pain putting it in though, because it's a different lace shaft, and when you put it in, because the gearbox comes in different pieces along the width of the gearbox, the lace shaft doesn't sit perfectly tight. It wobbles around, and so you have to hold that in place with some of your fingers, and then hold this motor plate down, and then push this guy in, and then tighten in the grub screw that tightens this hub against the lace shaft. And getting that all to behave while you're putting it together is a bit of a challenge. So this rear gearbox I am not a fan of. It is interesting, but I am no fan of it. Just a little bit more on the original lace shaft. So I commented in the introductory video about the Lazer ZX coming with a center differential, while the ZXR had a slipper clutch system like this guy here. Okay. Now the problem with the center diff is that it locks to the front wheels, and so the torque split really applies to the rear wheels. So no matter what happens as far as the diff action taking place, you will have full power going to the front wheels. So it's really a question of how much power you're applying to the rear wheels under acceleration. And basically you adjust that by loosening or tightening the center diff. So if you have any center diff action and you're on a high traction surface, you can end up with basically front wheel drive coming out of turns, and then the chassis is going to push on corner exit. So that's a bit of a problem. What I do like about this lace shaft setup is that the hub that drives the pulley that goes to the front. So this drives a pulley, like this pulley here would go on this bit, and there's another pulley just like this that would go on this hub that goes into here. This is a one-way pulley system that drives the front diff pulley. That's actually adjustable. So there's a little plate here on the end of this one-way unit. Kind of hard to tell, but you see this little silver piece here. Now that piece can be, when it sits on the lace shaft like so, let me see if I can just put it in there. Okay. Actually, probably goes in a little deeper, but anyway, you put that in, and then you tighten down a nut, which is actually this little nut right here. And if you make it tight enough, it will lock the front one-way pulley. And if you loosen it up just a bit, it'll either be fully one-way or maybe slightly kind of in between. So that's one thing I do like about this. Probably the only thing I like about this whole center lace shaft setup is the relative adjustability of the center one-way pulley that drives the front, which is good for adjusting basically brake bias, right? So if you can adjust the center pulley that drives the front diff between fully locked and one way, you're adjusting your braking behavior. And then with the center diff over here, you're adjusting the behavior on acceleration on corner exit. Now, there is a simpler way to do this, and Yokomo did it with their YZ10 870 setup. Arguably, this particular approach might not be as durable, but it was vastly simpler, at least as far as the center diff part is concerned. Because the one-way pulley on this was not adjustable, you had to sort of play tricks to do that. But anyway, there's your center pulley that drives the front diff is here, this plastic bit. And then there's a metal plate on the outer side here that you press against with a spring and a nut. So what happens is, if you make this nut, the spring tight, it's basically fully locked. And then if you loosen it a bit, this plate can slip against the housing, the outside housing of this pulley. And that will give you more rear torque bias than front torque bias on corner exit. And so that's kind of like the opposite of the center diff, where you get really more front torque bias than rear torque bias. Okay, so Yokomo had this quite a long time ago, and I run mine fully locked, so it doesn't really matter, but if you wanted to, you could adjust this. So that's kind of neat. Yeah, so that's kind of where I am right now, waiting on a few parts to come in. Again, these little pins to show up so I can tighten this down. Those are let's see, roller pins right here. There's one roller pin here, okay, and that goes in here, that tightens up against the belt that's inevitably going to go to the rear gearbox, and the other roller pin goes right here. So I'm just waiting on those pieces to come in. Then hopefully I can have this all finished up soon. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.